and also potential opportunities to engage North Korea on improving the rights of women. We are glad today to have Sarah Kim and Leif Erik Easley with us to discuss their new work on women's rights in North Korea. If you have not had a chance to read their new paper, The Neglected Crisis in North Korea, Women's Rights, I would commend it to you. We are also glad to have Ambassador Robert King with us today to help provide insight on this important issue. You should have all received the speakers' bios, but Sarah Kim is currently a visiting scholar for U.S.-South Korea Cooperation in Southeast Asia at the East-West Center and a contributing author here at KAI. Leif is an associate professor of international studies at Ewha Women's University in Seoul, while Ambassador King previously served as special envoy for North Korean human rights during the Obama administration. We will all have time at the end of today's discussion for questions from the audience, but please remember to submit those questions for our speakers. Use the Q&A function in the Zoom features. With that said, I would like to turn things over to Sarah to begin our discussion. Sarah?
Thank you, Troy, and the Korea Economic Institute for this meaningful opportunity to speak on women's rights in North Korea. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Professor Easley for helping me get interested in this topic, and of course, Ambassador King for his valuable time in commenting on our essay. North Korean human rights, including women's rights, is a very heavy issue for anyone to address. What Professor Easley and I wanted to do by drafting this short essay was to bring more attention to this topic by presenting a general overview, as well as by providing an insight into how important it is to engage with women when thinking about transforming the closed society of North Korea. So we hope that the audience will find the session informative, especially in light of Women's Equality Day coming up tomorrow on the 26th. So I will go right into our research. And our research is based on the compounds of data that we identified and analyzed. And according to our research, North Korean women are vulnerable to pressing challenges and violations of their rights in their daily lives, but they're also important agents of change in terms of contributing to an increasing market activity within North Korea. So I'll first review some of the challenges that North Korean women face, and then go on to talk about how they actually contribute to the North Korean economy. And in terms of the data and statistics that we referenced in our essay, we used a lot of defector interviews and NGO-based reports that are available. There are just so many challenges and crises that women face in North Korea, but some of them include malnutrition, access to basic healthcare, and according to the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, around 8.7 million North Koreans lack access to basic healthcare. And although NGOs do try to address these concerns, their efforts are often limited because of sanctions, funding issues, and also politics. And without this necessary healthcare system, North Korea is more vulnerable to pandemics, including the current COVID pandemic. And it ranks 193rd out of 195 countries, according to the Global Health Security Index. Another problem that they face is lack of sex education, which affects how North Korean men and women fundamentally conceptualize reproduction and menstruation from an early age. And they also lack access to basic sanitary needs and contraceptives. And women often make makeshift menstrual pads out of whatever they could find. And there's even a poll that suggests that 80% of North Korean women find sanitary conditions highly inadequate. Another problem is that women feel ashamed of seeking medical and legal support following acts of sexual violence. And there was a striking statistic saying that around a third of the first sexual experience for a lot of these women is actually forced. Marital rape is also another concern, but it's actually not recognized as a crime. And there's a lot of exploitation that goes on in detention facilities and political prison camps that include forced labor, torture, lack of food. And a lot of UN reports and defector interviews also cite accounts of numerous forced abortions and infanticide. Women also fall victim to sexual trafficking, get involved in prostitution rings, as well as bride trafficking. So from around 30 to 50,000 North Korean refugees in China, it's reported that around 70% of them are women. And once they do have children, it further complicates their situation because it makes it more difficult for them to leave them behind. And another big problem is that there's few legal repercussions for perpetrators. And even with the law on sex equality within North Korea, this is a bit different in that women are held to a different standard of performing primary duties to the state as mothers and wives. And this ideological enforcement was also reiterated within during the Women's Union Conference that happened with Kim Jong-un in June this year as well. And last but not least, this doesn't really come as a surprise, but North Korea also significantly lacks female representation in the country's decision-making bodies, which includes the Central Committee of the Workers' Party, the Politburo, and the Cabinet. And it ranks 126th globally in terms of the percentage of women in national parliaments. And after all of these dark statistics, another part of our research was highlighting their important role as economic agents in driving grassroots commerce and also engaging with the external environment as throughout cross-border trade. And just in terms of mobility, women are often more mobile than men in North Korea, as they're less tied to state-centered duties. So it's often difficult to gain, accurate statistics, but just looking at the proportion of female defectors in South Korea, it rose from 12.2% in 1998 to 80.7% by 2019. So cumulatively making up around 72% of North Korean defectors within South Korea. And a big part of their activity is within the informal markets or 장마당. And there's research saying that informal commerce actually makes up more than 70% of the household income for North Korean families. And also research saying that women are 50% more likely to be retail sellers than men. And it was released in 2020, but within a report by KINU, the Korean Institute for National Unification, also stated that the wives' income these days is believed to exceed the husband's income because of these 장마당 activities. And just to put it in the current perspective, there was a report saying 장마당 markets were seen to be still active despite the coronavirus pandemic. In addition to informal markets, there's cross-border trade, and women also work abroad in China, and sometimes they're given actual permits by governments lasting from around 3 months. And a lot of them do work in different areas such as Yanbian, in factories as well as in restaurants, and they send remittances back to their families in the north. But I also want to highlight that this is also an area of concern by the United Nations because there is heavy surveillance by the government over these contract laborers, and it's reported that 70 to 90% of overseas wages for them are withheld by the government. So this is of grave concern. And once these permits expire, a lot of women also turn into legal migrants or legal economic migrants, as the Chinese government calls them. And then they get susceptible to forced repatriation or refoulement by the Chinese government. And also, to put that in the current perspective, according to the Human Rights Watch, it's believed that the Chinese government is holding at least 1170 North Koreans in detention. And a lot of these are women. And also recently, China was found to have repatriated around 50 North Korean escapees. So this is an ongoing problem that must be addressed. In terms of what can be done, and I believe that we'll be discussing this more in detail later with Dr. Easley and of course, Ambassador King. But just to point out a couple of things that Professor Easley and I have found important is first and foremost, keeping these discussions alive and moving. So this is exactly what our essay aimed to do. by highlighting all of these statistics in a shorter version as an informational sheet, and to advocate for better transparency in delivering humanitarian assistance, such as food and medicines. And a lot of NGOs have been working on ground to address these concerns, and even establishing entrepreneurship workshops on and offline. But because travel to North Korea is so limited, it's difficult for us, and we often have to rely on information that are provided by these NGOs or self-reports by North Korea, which might not be as accurate. And due to COVID-19, there has also been a significant reduction in the diplomatic presence within North Korea. And in the UN report on the situation of human rights in North Korea, which was published in July this year, it emphasized this exact difficulty in engaging with North Korea because of the lack of diplomatic presence. And it also highlighted that a lot of the reports are overdue, the ones that the North Korean government is supposed to submit. And this also includes one for CEDAW, or Convention on the Elimination on All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which North Korea has been a signatory to as of 2001. And in addition, despite the landmark 2014 UN Commission of Inquiry report on North Korean human rights abuses, which called the violations crimes against humanity, we still have not been able to refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court. But in terms of highlighting what's also important, I feel like collecting data is very important. And I recently saw that the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, NKDB, released a database or data collection on perpetrators of North Korean human rights. But another problem that comes with that is that oftentimes governments are managing these collected data, and there's some sort of degree in security clearance issues. So although we do have some open source data available through NKDB or Bank of Korea, it becomes difficult when trying to access all of these data. I know a lot of organizations are also doing advocacy work in terms of developing educational programs, trying to raise awareness on women's rights and human rights in general for the foreign audience, including those in South Korea. And this all kind of highlights the power of information. And some organizations even try to send information directly into North Korea through radio broadcasts. Governments, I feel like, should also work together to approach North Korea with a coordinated message. And after having gone through all of those, dark statistics, to end on a bit of a positive note, according to organizations, human rights awareness seems to be gaining more traction within North Korea. And according to the same Kinu report that I cited earlier, women seem to have a greater sense of identity thanks to their greater economic or material role within the household. And perhaps Ambassador King could expand on this further, but hopefully there is an increased willingness among North Korean officials also to engage with the UN human rights mechanisms. So I will end my review of the essay there and pass it on to Troy and Dr. Easley, who will provide some policy implications, hopefully, on this issue.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for helping to let us know sort of about what some of the challenges are in North Korea. Leif, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Troy. It's always a pleasure to do a program with you. I'm endlessly impressed with the work that Kathy, Mark, Kyle, and your entire KEI team produce to the benefit of our US-Korea studies community. You know that I'm a security diplomacy guy, so I wouldn't have tried to publish on North Korean women's rights by myself for fear of being ticketed for getting out of my lane. But Sarah was one of my star students, and after she had been researching North Korean women's rights and especially border crossers into China for her undergraduate thesis at Ewha and master's thesis at Georgetown, we decided to team up on this journal article. I'm grateful to Sarah because I continue to learn a lot about these important issues. When Sarah and I started writing this paper, it was well before the pandemic changed everyone's lives. So what I thought I'd do in less than 10 minutes is bring our discussion into the current political and policy context. Colleagues will remember how in the 1990s, the arduous March famine was believed to have pushed many North Korean women out of their domestic roles into more of a economic role of securing the basic livelihoods for their families. And as Sarah mentioned, the Jamandang really expanded over the years. But now the current economic situation is again very dire, especially due to the border closures during the pandemic. And the implications for North Korean women's market activity have yet to be assessed. North Korea continues to report no COVID cases to the WHO, but analysts are skeptical, and we are, of course, watching the border with China for signs of reopening. Even though Pyongyang has been refusing talks with Washington and Seoul, the US and ROK governments have discussed coordinating humanitarian initiatives, including public health assistance, pandemic quarantine supplies, clean drinking water, and perhaps even vaccines. This doesn't have to happen government to government. It could go through international organizations and non-governmental organizations. Ambassador Sung Kim, who just wrapped up a visit here in Seoul, wrote in a Hankyoreh op-ed yesterday, and I quote, "Consistent with the Biden-Harris administration's focus on human rights, we continue to advocate for the human rights of the North Korean people. The United States will continue to support the provision of humanitarian aid consistent with international standards for access and monitoring to the most vulnerable North Koreans, regardless of progress on denuclearization." Now, this is different from the Trump policy, and we can talk more about that in discussion if you'd like, but Pyongyang, as of yet, is unimpressed. US ROK coordination has been good, as seen with the extensive joint statement at the Biden-Moon summit in May. But the two sides could do more for alliance unity by improving regional cooperation with Japan and getting on the same page about information campaigns. I'm sure many of our participants today recall the recent controversy over leaflets. But the main problems that are faced in regards to trying to re-engage North Korea are products out of Pyongyang. And here are three several examples, three puzzling examples that I'd like to highlight to bring us up to the current situation. North Korea, you would think, would be desperate to reopen its economy. And the way of doing that, of course, is by securing enough vaccines. But we don't see a great amount of urgency on the part of the Kim regime to secure vaccines from abroad. Second, North Korea did agree to reconnect the inter-Korean hotlines, but after just 2 weeks, they stopped answering the phone in correlation with complaints about the US-South Korea combined exercises, which are regular defensive exercises that everyone knew were coming. And third, they announced a no-fly and sail zone recently, but then they didn't launch a projectile into that area that they announced to be protected and off limits. So I think what we're seeing is North Korean domestic policy and domestic politics, particularly regime legitimacy issues, presenting obstacles for international humanitarian cooperation, being engaged in one-upsmanship versus Seoul, and continuing for domestic political reasons to exaggerate the external threat vis-a-vis the United States. So some people say that US policy needs to show Pyongyang more incentives, but Washington has been signaling that meaningful humanitarian cooperation is possible with sanctions waivers, which are possible under the current sanctions regime. Of course, the lifting of major sanctions would require progress toward denuclearization. So basically, it's the Kim regime's move, which hopefully will be toward post-pandemic opening rather than weapons testing provocations. In the meantime, it's very difficult to address North Korean women's rights while the country remains in self-imposed isolation. So Sarah and I tried in a follow-up piece to our article in Ethics and International Affairs to suggest applications of new technologies for trying to understand the situation in North Korea and planning for future engagement. We published an analysis in NK News entitled Utilizing Artificial Intelligence to Improve Women's Rights in North Korea. And I'd like to highlight just three possible AI or machine learning applications to the study of North Korea relevant to women's and human rights. First, AI can help document atrocities by archiving and analyzing big data, including interviews with female defectors on adversities that they've faced. But it's necessary to carefully anonymize interview data and increase cybersecurity for defectors' private information. Second, AI can also be used in targeting humanitarian assistance where it's needed most. Data is patchy and often unreliable, but with machine learning tools, you can aggregate and analyze many economic indicators and even defector testimonies in big data databases. You can use satellite imagery of farming fields and variations in rice prices to estimate North Korea's agricultural production and hence needed food aid. And you can even look at social media posts along the China and North Korea border to try to infer cross-border movements once North Korea starts to reopen again after the pandemic that reflect patterns of supply and demand. And third, relief organizations could combine AI tracking capabilities with observable indicators on the ground to address some of the transparency issues regarding whether their aid has been delivered. So you can look at satellite imagery, estimating assembly at markets and even health clinics, and digital photos that are used to confirm aid delivery on the ground can be examined by machine learning tools to determine whether they've been forged or altered. I'd like to conclude by saying that it would be helpful for women's issues if both the United States and South Korea appointed ambassadors for North Korean human rights. I expect this will be debated during South Korea's presidential campaign, which is already underway. I would suggest that it's useful to have American and ROK counterparts coordinating with each other, partner countries, with various government agencies, and with civil society to map out a productive agenda on North Korean human rights. That can be simultaneously about accountability for and engagement of North Korea. Ambassador King is the best person to discuss this, and I appreciate that he has agreed to share his insights with us. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussion.
Well, thank you, Leif, and I'm glad you decided to get out of your lane and work on this because I think it's an important topic, and I'm glad you were doing it with Sarah. Ambassador King, your thoughts?
Thanks very much. First of all, I want to thank Sarah and Professor Easley for what they've done in terms of focusing attention on women's issues in North Korea. Unfortunately, I think women's issues have generally been lumped together with the general human rights issues that we face in North Korea. And there are unique problems, unique issues involving women, and I think it's important to highlight those and to bring them out. There are policy implications as well as interest in terms of what's happening with women. Women play a disproportionate role in the market economy, as has been mentioned. The defectors, over 70% of defectors who have left North Korea in the last 15 years are women. And that's a reflection of their greater economic flexibility and our entrepreneurial efforts. But it's been very interesting to see that it's women who are leaving North Korea in greater numbers than men. But I very strongly recommend the articles that we are discussing here, because I think it's an important issue that we need to deal with. One thing I want to also mention in this context is the UN office in Seoul, the High Commissioner for Human Rights office in Seoul. This is an office that was set up in the aftermath of the completion of the Commission of Inquiry report. And a small office was established there. The South Korean government was helpful at the time in terms of making arrangements for the office to be established. They have done an excellent job of putting together important information that has been funneled into the United Nations channels. It's been particularly helpful for the United Nations for the South Korean government to provide access to defectors so that the UN personnel in Seoul are able to interview recent arrivals from North Korea, be able to pull together information and that kind of thing. The quality and value of this information was particularly highlighted in October of 2020 when the UN General Assembly focused on issues related to women with the Special Rapporteur on North Korean human rights presenting a report on that issue. One of the most important aspects of that was the material that was provided by the Seoul office in a report which they put together detailing what has happened and what the conditions are for women who have left North Korea and what conditions were like in North Korea. Unfortunately, most of the people who leave the defectors who leave North Korea don't make it out on the first try. And the result is most of these people have the experience of having been captured, returned to North Korea, serving prison time, and then they've made another effort and eventually been successful. But the stories and the accounts of prison conditions were particularly harrowing. I was very pleased that the article that Sarah and Professor Easley wrote includes a number of references to the report that the UN office in Seoul put together on that. The other thing that complicates the women's issues with regard to North Korea is the very negative role that China plays in this whole process. Women who seek to leave North Korea have only one route out, and that is through China. And the difficulty of crossing the border on the North Korean side is bad, but once they get into China, conditions are equally harrowing. The Chinese are complicit in terms of the brutality that's seen against women, and I think it's important that we call attention to what the role the Chinese have played in this whole process. Because the Chinese have taken the view that North Koreans are to be returned to North Korea when they're found in China, even if they're trying to get away from North Korea, if they because they're seeking to go elsewhere. The Chinese always return them to North Korea. There are very few exceptions where the Chinese have not returned these defectors, and as I say, 70% of them are women. And what this has done has made women's situation, once they get into China, very precarious. It opened them up to exploitation, to forced marriages, to sex trafficking, and some of the stories are particularly harrowing. And this aspect of the issue is something that I think is particularly disturbing and particularly important that we try to deal with. One of the interesting and useful bits of information that's been gathered are some of the reports that have been produced by Court Robinson, who's a demographic researcher at Johns Hopkins University, who's been able to do studies of women leaving North Korea, conditions in China, how many of them remain in China and for what length of time, and what conditions are like for children that are born of either sex trafficking or women who are in forced marriages in China. So these issues, I think, are an added complication that you don't normally have with in dealing with sex trafficking and women's issues in other countries. I was interested in the suggestion of using artificial intelligence as a way of providing opportunities to understand and monitor what's happening in terms of treatment of women. And I think it sounds like a very useful kind of thing. The one difficulty that I see is the cost of carrying out this kind of research and the difficulty of access to the information that will provide, that can be helpful. We certainly do a great deal of artificial intelligence looking at nuclear and military issues in North Korea. And it would hopefully be some way that we could also include some of these issues involving women and human rights and working out some way of accessing this information to be able to do it. But I think it would be a very useful kind of thing if we were able to increase the information that we have available. But again, let me say how much I appreciate the effort you've put into the reports that you've written and how helpful and important they are. Thanks very much, Troy, for having this discussion, because I think it's an important issue.
Well, thank you, Ambassador King. And I'd like to now, try to move us to have a little bit of a discussion amongst ourselves on, some of these issues. And, we've talked about the issue of, maybe using artificial intelligence. But I'd like to sort of maybe first start off talking about, are there sort of practical ways we can engage North Korea on this issue to maybe make a difference? One thing, and I'm just putting this out as an idea, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but that you discuss in the paper is that, women often face the potential for sexual assault if they are arrested for a crime or being interrogated, because interrogations are done by men and not by women. Is maybe some type of practical area like this, maybe something that's not even perhaps too public facing, something where we could engage North Korea to where maybe they might take steps that would practically improve the conditions for women? Or are there other maybe areas, that you can think of that might be a good place to try and engage them on?
Well, Troy, maybe I can start out by responding to a couple points and then asking Sarah to address your question about the interaction of North Korean authorities, often male enforcement officers with female economic actors in the marketplaces, but also border crossers. They have to deal with a lot of bribery and of course sexual harassment and even sexual assault. So perhaps Sarah can address that. I'd like to pick up on two threads that and Ambassador King, who shared so many insights with us. I wish we could devote another 30 minutes just to his remarks. But there are two threads in particular that I think I might be able to productively address in just a minute or two. One is, I think Sarah and I are very much in agreement about the point that China's role is crucial here. And the COI report and many other excellent high standard pieces of research have documented what an important role China plays, and indeed what factor that China can be in the negative outcomes for vulnerable populations of North Korean women. And so we would certainly like to see Beijing held to more of an international standard regarding North Korean escapees and giving them the legal protections that they deserve as refugees in many cases. But this is a difficult subject to approach with Beijing, especially when U.S.-China relations are so strained as they are now, and China sees any cooperation, even with the United Nations, regarding North Korean refugees in China, to be a sensitive issue in their relationship with the DPRK, because the DPRK would see this as a potential matter of betrayal. So the PRC tends to deal with North Korean citizens in China, they say, according to Chinese law and bilateral agreements with Pyongyang. And I think if Ambassador King has a successor in Washington and a successor counterpart in Seoul in the coming months or coming year, I hope this would be an issue that they would try to address very diplomatically and try to find points of leverage on engaging China on this issue. Just very briefly on the application of AI. Of course, AI means many things and different things to different people. And in our piece for NK News, much of what we discussed were actually some machine learning tools, pretty straightforward, imagery analysis. But AI is becoming more and more capable. It's nowhere near the sci-fi films yet. But the beauty of it is that while the startup costs may be significant for tailoring algorithms and getting the tools in place, as Ambassador King has said, once you've got tailored AI solutions for these sorts of problems, they're actually very cost-effective ways of dealing with tremendous amounts of data. And there is a lot of data being generated regarding North Korea. It is of an uneven quality and often patchy, but I think there really is a lot of potential for applying new technological tools to questions of observing and learning about North Korea, and even helping to empower some of the important civil society and non-governmental actors in relation to North Korea, including North Korean women. Sarah, would you care to pick it up from there?
Sure. So as we briefly discussed when I was going over our essay points, oftentimes we have to use what's available on ground to work with these problems. And I guess one of the solutions that we presented in our essay was that we could make use of those embassies that are in Pyongyang to create some sort of outreach programs for labor, raising labor standards. Perhaps Ambassador King could also help us see if this is actually feasible to do, because when actually talking with a lot of governments, governments seem to be a bit hesitant in taking actions and improving human rights issues in North Korea, because it's inevitably tied to politics as well. So of course there are difficulties, and if we had the solutions, I would be walking up to UN right now, but that was one of the solutions that we had. And another one was in regards to China, inviting customs officials to UN best practice seminars. And with regards to that as well, it's pretty difficult to assess its feasibility, but that was one of the solutions that we recommended in our paper. Professor Easley, do you have anything to add?
It's maybe hard to make this suggestion directly to the DPRK, but through these sort of capacity building programs that Sarah is talking about, it would be great if North Korea could be provided nudges and maybe even incentives to increase the number of female border guards and female staff at incarceration centers, and female officers that patrol the markets, because then that might alleviate some of the gender-based discrimination that North Korean women face at the hands of North Korean authorities.
Could I make a comment, Troy?
Yes, please.
A couple of things that have been mentioned. One of the things that I think we probably have not given enough attention to is the important role the United Nations can play in these efforts. The Commission of Inquiry was very important in terms of establishing what was going on in North Korea in terms of human rights. But the UN has also played a very positive role in terms of trying to prod North Korea in terms of its human rights record. The UN Human Rights Council in Geneva has a process where every country that's a member of the United Nations goes through what's called the Universal Periodic Review as part of its membership in the United Nations. It has to make a report on its human rights efforts, what it's done, what changes in laws have been made. Other countries then have the opportunity to ask questions and to raise issues. The North Koreans have participated in this process. And it's been a useful thing to see the North Koreans there making the argument. They're focused on human rights and they're giving it attention. I think there's a correlation with some of the changes that have been made. The North Koreans are very careful about how far they're willing to go on human rights, but they've been willing to make some changes, for example, in treatment of persons with disabilities. There has been a UN special rapporteur who deals with disabilities that was actually invited to come to Pyongyang, spent a couple of days there, was limited in terms of what she was able to do, but was able to be there and to raise issues. I think we need to find ways of using United Nations mechanisms to put pressure on North Korea on these women's issues. And I think we need to work in terms of giving greater attention and focus to the Special Rapporteur on North Korea human rights, Mr. Thomas O.J. Quintana, who is the current Special Rapporteur, has played a very positive role in terms of those efforts. So I think the UN would play a major role in terms of this, and we need to figure out ways of using the United Nations to push North Korea in positive directions on this. I agree with your comment about a special rapporteur both in the United States and South Korea focused on human rights issues in North Korea being a very positive step forward. Having spent more than 7 years doing that, it's a frustrating position because the limitations in terms of what you can do are very evident. But it's also encouraging because there are areas where you can make progress and where you can raise these issues and encourage movement in the right direction. I think it's particularly important in terms of keeping this issue on the agenda with China. And that was one of the things that I did when I was the special envoy. I made a point of visiting China about once a year. I was in Beijing. I met with Chinese officials there to raise the human rights concerns. I met with Communist Party officials who are also play an important role in policy towards North Korea. And the idea was to continue to press them on allowing North Korean refugees who happen to go through China to leave China without returning them to North Korea simply without even giving it any thought or attention. So I think I would definitely agree that that's a step that we need to take. We need to get a special envoy. I think the Biden administration has indicated, Secretary of State Tony Blinken has said on a couple of occasions that they will appoint a special envoy, and I'm sure that will happen at some point. And we'll hope that it moves things in the right direction. Thanks, Troy.
Thank you. So I'd like to move to audience questions in a couple of minutes. So if anyone does have a question, please, again, use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your question. But, I kind of want to build a little bit off of this discussion, specifically, Ambassador King, your comment about thinking about working through the UN. One of the things that, I've done some work on sanctions and that sort of sticks out to me about the actual sanctions resolutions is we often think about them being constructed in terms of the United States and the international community calling for North Korea to give up its ballistic weapons and nuclear weapons programs, and that the sanctions are, basically tied into that. And there is a significant element of that. But I think what is often missed is if you go through and you look at the resolutions, They also call on North Korea to give up its weapons programs to improve the lives of its population. And I think we often forget that aspect of it. And I would venture to say that even when we think in that context, that we don't think about things like the needs of women in terms of feminine hygiene products and things that are important. And so perhaps one of the things we need to do is encourage the UN and others that when we do talk about this issue of that North Korea does have an obligation to improve the lives of the population, it isn't simply something about providing food or healthcare, but that there's a broader dimension to this. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts sort of on that aspect of it as well.
One of the
Well,
things
again,
that
please, Ambassador.
no, go ahead.
Well, I was going to pick up a couple of threads, and then while I speak before thinking, ask Sarah to speak after thinking about some of the issues that she's researched regarding feminine hygiene products and access for women's health. I was just prompted by the ambassador's comments and Troy's intervention as well, to think about how the vaccine needs of North Korea could be an opportunity. And I don't want to exaggerate the opportunity because it's still very difficult to work with North Korea on vaccines, as COVAX is finding when North Korea doesn't sign the waiver for legal responsibility for side effects and so on. And it's very difficult to get the contract made for the provision of vaccines. But as Ambassador King touched upon, UN organizations have been doing really important work, like UNICEF, in engaging with North Korea. And even though they don't have the staff on the ground that would be really, really helpful and useful to have right now, there are still efforts ongoing by UN organizations to have cooperation for distribution of vaccines, for example. So I think that the United States and South Korea are willing to help North Korea with vaccines, and if it's not politically palpable for North Korea to receive Pfizer shots from the United States or AstraZeneca jabs from South Korea, those provisions of aid can be made through international organizations and NGOs in order to be more politically palpable to the North. So I think there's opportunity there to not only restart humanitarian work, but also to reestablish lines of communication and dialogue with the DPRK as it begins to transition itself to a more post-pandemic mode. And it's going to need vaccines to do that. I would also just briefly mention my personal concern. I don't want to say that I'm speaking for Sarah on this, but my personal concern about the pattern of some political leaders in South Korea to kind of bury human rights issues for the benefit of prioritizing political engagement with the North Korean regime. And I'm not a political leader. It's easy for an academic to say this, but I really wish that human rights and women's rights would remain high up on the agenda when other states and organizations are dealing with North Korea. Sure, it's going to lead to some tense moments and maybe some walkouts of meetings here and there again, but I think it's very important to stick to the values and interests that are at stake with women's rights and North Korean human rights. And there's ways of doing that while engaging the Kim regime. And I think one example is to say, well, we have different means of assisting North Korea. South Korea has so many ideas. I mean, you can just listen to a speech by Unification Minister Ian Young for a whole menu of things that South Korea is willing to do with the North. And I don't think that South Korea should just help North Korea for free. There should be reciprocity. And one of the most basic things that there could be reciprocity on is separated families having access to their loved ones in North Korea before so many of these members of that generation leave us. You would hope that they would at least have the opportunity to engage in some of these video conference reunions that South Korea has been setting up the infrastructure for. So that was my intervention. Perhaps Sarah can pick up on the women's health and public health question.
Before I pick up on the women's health thing, the South Korea aspect was also very concerning for me, because just in terms of even the basic task of data collection, it's been so difficult. And right before coming into this webinar, I saw a press release by NKDB saying that they wouldn't be publishing their annual white paper this year because of restrictions to data. And even with the Human Rights Act in South Korea in 2016, we still haven't seen the Human Rights Foundation, being launched or anything. So all of these are pressing concerns for me. As for the health conditions part, I just feel like having medical supplies readily available for a woman is one of the most pressing tasks, because not only in terms of the makeshift menstrual pads, but I also learned that even for emergency contraceptives, people have to get them not through medical centers, but by getting them through markets. And just not having that basic access is so much. And even with sex education, not having that, it's just, I feel like a lot of that really contributes to the fundamental idea of women's rights. And those were some of the things that I wanted to highlight for both Dr. Easley and Troy's comments.
Could I make one quick comment? One of the things that that was mentioned is how do we use the UN? One of the things that we might be able to do with the United Nations is to put some pressure on North Korea for some fairly modest changes that could make a difference. For example, prison guards you mentioned as one of the issues that was of concern in your paper. And I would think that putting some pressure on North Korea to have female guards with female prisoners would be one way of, putting some pressure on North Korea. It's the kind of thing that countries that participate in the Universal Periodic Review process and the Human Rights Council in Geneva could get together and say, this is an area where we ought to push on the North Koreans. And I think that would be a useful thing to do. I was in Geneva for the first Universal Periodic Review that was conducted by for North Korea. And the North Koreans made a point of having a very high-level delegation from Seoul. They had women as members of the delegation. There was a real effort to sort of follow the procedures. And I think there may be some ways that we might do this in terms of using UN mechanisms. And I think it's something we ought to look at. How do we get countries who are concerned about these issues to work together in some concerted effort? Because I think we could maybe make some progress. It's not going to be major differences, but it's going to make differences around the edge, and I think it would be worth doing.
So I have a question from Yesun Kim. Now that North Korea's border restrictions are even tighter with COVID-19, what specific implications could there be regarding women's Jangmadang domestic economic activities, especially since many women must have relied on migrating to and working in other countries prior to the pandemic?
Again, Sarah might be better at addressing the shortages in the market because she's been looking at that. I think clearly the border region activity has been so heavily reduced because of the clampdown and the national lockdown implemented by DPRK authorities, So we can see that the border crossing is not a small fraction of what it used to be. It's very difficult for smugglers, for semi-official traders to be able to get those products that were being enjoyed by consumers in the Jammadong in North Korea. And I would point out that some analysts are concerned that the Kim regime is actually making use of this COVID-19 pandemic as an opportunity to crack down on economic activity that it sees as not beneficial, or to crack down on actors that perhaps have gotten outside of the bounds of loyalty to the regime. So it's difficult for us, given limited information that's coming out of North Korea at this point. But I'm very concerned that, as the questioner raised, the border restrictions have had seriously negative implications for female economic actors, and the North Korean regime may be going even further than their suffering of lack of access to supply of goods that they want to sell on the markets, and actually going after some actors that the regime considers subversive, and some materials that the regime considers subversive, such as South Korean dramas, and even South Korean fashion and South Korean style snacks may be targeted by the regime as sort of cultural pollution that threatens North Korea's national identity, and of course the pride and legitimacy of the regime.
Pastor King, was there something you wanted to add as well?
Just a couple of comments on the difficulties in the market. I've seen the reports that Professor Easley mentioned about tightening on the markets by the regime. It's a particularly difficult time because of the tightness of the border to be able to get a lot of the products that are important in the market. And while I think there probably are some things that could be done, it may not be the kind of thing that can be done during this pandemic period, when it's going to be much more difficult to get anything in and out of North Korea.
No, I agree. That's a challenge. I think one other challenge that any market actor faces right now is access to capital and credit. North Korea doesn't have a central banking system similar to virtually every other country in the world, where they can engage in quantitative easing, or they can engage in loans to businesses and other economic actors to try and either keep them employed or something. And from the conversations I've had with some people with contacts internally, while the Dongju are still providing loans to certain activities, understandably they've pulled back on the money they're letting out too. So you're seeing a contraction, most likely, of credit within the economy, and I'm sure that's having a negative impact as well. Well, we are almost at our ending point. So I would like to thank you, Sarah and Leif. This is a very good paper. I do recommend people read it. And I would like to thank you both for coming on to share your work with us, both on that paper and the NK News article touching on the artificial intelligence ideas. And Ambassador King, thank you as well again for joining us to try and provide some perspective and bring this issue really more to the forefront of everyone. I do think this is important. I hope this helps start a conversation to where we're talking about this more frequently. Thank you all.
Thank you.